In the second part of this video, we're going to actually practice filling out the say, do, mean chart for Frederick Douglass's passage from his second autobiography. I provided guided questions for you in each of the columns to help you pick out the important information to write a summary and also to look for important rhetorical choices in order to analyze his use of language. I've already pulled up the online interactive text using the BPS login system. So I'm going to play the first paragraph for you as we follow along and read it. So I just hit play here.
I lived in the family of Master Hugh at Baltimore 7 years, during which time, as the almanac makers say of the weather, my condition was variable. The most interesting feature of my history here was my learning to read and write under somewhat marked disadvantages. In attaining this knowledge, I was compelled to resort to indirections by no means congenial to my nature, and which were really humiliating to me. My mistress, who had begun to teach me, was suddenly checked in her benevolent design by the strong advice of her husband. In faithful compliance with this advice, the good lady had not only ceased to instruct me herself, but had set her face as a flint against my learning to read by any means. It is due, however, to my mistress to say that she did not adopt this course in all its stringency at the first. She either thought it unnecessary, or she lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was, at least, necessary for her to have some training and some hardening in the exercise of the slaveholder's prerogative to make her equal to forgetting my human nature and character, and to treating me as a thing destitute of a moral or an intellectual nature. Mrs. Old, my mistress, was, as I have said, a most kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the humanity of her heart and the simplicity of her mind, she set out, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another.
Okay, so let's go back and look at the question for paragraph number 1. It says, why did Douglass's mistress teach him to read? So let's look back at paragraph 1. And it says right here that she set out, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human ought to be treated. Earlier in the paragraph, he does make reference to what humans should be treated like as moral or intellectual characters. Keep in mind that the mistress initially wanted to teach him to read, but stopped doing so because her husband advised her against teaching a slave to read. And this wasn't easy for his mistress. Mrs. Auld had to learn the hardened ways necessary to be a more stern master to Frederick Douglass. So I'm going to go back to my chart here and fill in this answer. I'm going to look back to remind myself what he said. Okay, so this side is asking us what is Douglass's tone, and explain how this tone helps him achieve his purpose. If you need to review a list of tone words, I've linked a document here. Tone describes the author's feelings that he, in this case, he wants to portray by his use of language. So there's a list here, a lot of words that describe author's tone. Notice that they're often adjectives. This is an extensive list. However, there are more words that you can pick through. So I'm looking through this. I think that although Douglass is not extremely angry, we can sense some anger in his tone, yet he's also reserved, where he doesn't want to be too angry, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we could say that he's straightforward. So going back again to my question, what is Douglas's tone, and explain how it helps him achieve his purpose. Before we think about purpose, it's important to understand who Douglas's audience was. At this time, his audience was mostly white people, and they were mostly in the North. He wanted to show the horrors of slavery, so they would do more to abolish it. So, why is he reserved yet angry? Overly emotional narrators do not always come across as reliable. Douglas wants his audience to believe that he's telling the truth about slavery. Although he does a good job of mostly hiding his anger, he is angry, and he wants his audience also to be angry, which helps him accomplish his purpose of getting his audience members to be angry in order to do more for the cause of abolition. So after thinking that all through, I'm going to type up my response. Okay, so there is my response to this one. I've analyzed tone, and I've explained how it accomplished his purpose. Now, your job is to go through the remaining paragraphs and analyze those both for what Douglas is saying and what is he doing. Again, I provided questions for you so that you are picking out the right information. At the very end of this chart, you're going to put everything together from your analysis and come up with what does this passage show his readers, excuse me, and come up with an overall meaning. When you're done with this assignment, please submit it to Moodle Rooms for assessment.